if I come into a worship service and find it irrelevant, then I have to ask myself one question. Is it because God is irrelevant to me or I am irrelevant to God? What is the reason for this irrelevance? Is the irrelevance that my life is not measuring up? Or is the irrelevance the fact that somehow God doesn't seem to have a vital place in my life? See, Jesus Christ continually contradicts us in the way we experience ourselves as alive. And He compels us to radically redefine what we mean by life. He encounters us the way He encountered the disciples on Easter Sunday. They were the ones marked out for death. Those who had survived Him were really the dead. He, the dead one, was really the living.
The topic of worship can sometimes be a sensitive subject. In the United States alone, there are literally dozens of church denominations, each with a different approach to the worship service. So how is one to know their way around the world of worship? What aspects are essential to the worship service, and what can be left to personal preference? Well, stay tuned over the next half hour as we continue to examine the subject of Christian worship. Welcome once again to Let My People Think, the weekly program featuring Christian apologist Ravi Zacharias. Ravi is an international evangelist and speaker with a mission to blend the domains of the heart and the mind. His work takes him to locations all over the world where he seeks to reach the skeptic and to help strengthen the faith of Christian believers. On last week's program, we looked at some minor problems that can arise in corporate worship. But this week, Ravi will begin to examine some more critical problems that Christians can run into when it comes to the worship service. Now, here's Ravi with more.
Number 4, forms, I think, become spurious when they force us to pretend that things are not the way they really are. For example, for me to stand up and sing, and He walks with me and talks with me and tells me that I am His own, and the joy we share as we tarry there none other has ever known. To sing it while I don't even have a devotional life is a spurious. If our hymnology were our theology, I think we'd run into problems. Because experientially sometimes it just does not measure up. Now, please bear in mind, I'm not knocking it, I'm just saying a form becomes dangerous. Sometimes, for example, in rallies we are forced to say things and do things that may not be very real to our own experience. And we conjure up emotion in an effort to sustain essence. If you clap loud enough and hard enough and strong enough, you will become happy whether you are happy or not. You see, so we take the form and force it into an existence here. Now, please listen to this argument very, very carefully. There is a sense in which Jesus is there to contradict us. In other words, if I come into a worship service and find it irrelevant, then I have to ask myself one question. Is it because God is irrelevant to me or I am irrelevant to God? What is the reason for this irrelevance? Is the irrelevance that my life is not measuring up? Or is the irrelevance the fact that somehow God doesn't seem to have a vital place in my life? See, Jesus Christ continually contradicts us in the way we experience ourselves as alive. And He compels us to radically redefine what we mean by life. He encounters us the way He encountered the disciples on Easter Sunday. They were the ones marked out for death. Those who had survived Him were really the dead. He, the dead one, was really the living. And so Jesus had to stop the disciples and say, look, boys, don't weep for me. Women, don't weep for me. Because I've never been more alive than I am now. But weep for yourselves and your children, because this generation is the dead generation. What do I mean by this? Suppose I were to come in feeling very badly that, I had a bad day at work yesterday or something, and that maybe would like to have seen better income. And I sit in the room there, the sanctuary there, and the pastor is preaching on the refugee problem of the world. And I say, wait a minute, I came here with enough problems, you're dumping one more on me. That's a good question. Maybe I am intended to be lifted beyond my own little world and look at a world that is much larger than mine. That is what I call the contradiction of Christ. Maybe I came to the church feeling very good. You know, it's so nice to be in a nation where you're free to worship. And he's going to preach from the text that these were sawn asunder in this world and walked around in sheepskins, and so on. I say, I was just feeling so good about how nice it is to be here, and you have thrown this heavy on me. What is happening? At that moment, I think what is really happening is that I am being asked to make my life relevant to God's Word. The Word is already relevant. I'm the one who has to do the changing. This is the challenge of the leader in worship every Sunday morning, and that's why it's so hard. What he's taking is 400 different people. One who has come from a world of the stock index. The other one who's come from the fact where he's been turning a nut and bolt 3 turns every day for 8 hours. A third fellow has come from the fact that his son was picked up on drugs through the week. And a fourth fellow has come from the fact that his wife just told him this week she doesn't love him anymore. And a fifth fellow who comes there just having taken a course in Orthodox theology. How are you going to be relevant to all 5 of them? The relevance is already there. The challenge is for these people to become relevant to that. And that is the task, I think, of leading in worship. You see, this is so clear in the Old Testament. This is so clear in the Old Testament, where God actually takes over 10 chapters to dictate the design of the tabernacle. Now, don't tell me God didn't have more important things to do with Moses. All he could have said to Moses was, gather for a place for me to worship. But you see, today, for example, we do not send our church leaders to Sinai to get a description for our next building. And the reason we don't do that is because in those days, they went to the sanctuary. These days, we take the sanctuary with us. So when 400 people come to worship, they are really not coming to the sanctuary, but 400 sanctuaries are coming into a building to worship. Which means, if it was so important to God how the tabernacle was kept and what was in it, it is equally important to God how this temple is maintained and what is in it. For this is where I truly worship with Him now. And if somebody comes to me and says, I'm free to choose any way I want, this is where the charismatic movement, when it's taken to an extreme, commits suicide. As soon as individuality has a priority over community, you're going to run into problems. I think I may be free to choose to worship so long as I remain within the confines of truth in my private life, but in the corporate worship, there is a surrender involved. And I think the hardest difference for the evangelical is to have a distinction between the priesthood of the believer and not make it into the papacy of the believer. Because at that point, it becomes ex cathedra, inerrant. I cannot make any errors. When I speak, I'm infallible. A corruption of form comes about when one thinks he is free to choose. Number 2, when Christianity is reduced to a system of values. Reduced to a system of values. And worship just becomes an affirmation of those values. Why do I say that? Some years ago, the Dalai Lama came to New York. The Dalai Lama is from Tibet, worshipped as the incarnation of the Buddha. I don't think there was anything sadder than for him to step into one of our large churches in New York City. And thousands of clergymen gathered together to hear him deliver the address. Here is a man who's an atheist, who affirms himself to be the incarnation of Buddha. And Protestant Catholic ministers sitting there and walking away wowed by him. After all, we all believe in the same fundamentals of right and wrong. That's not the issue. That's why I don't like worship. I don't think God sits at the top of a hierarchy. He is. And every other God isn't. And Christianity is Jesus Christ coming not to make bad people good, but to make dead people live. And if we are not alive unto God, goodness is a secondary issue. And I will deal with this as we come to the Old Testament concept. For you see, in the Old Testament concept, first out of Egypt, redemption, then the law, morality or righteousness, then the tabernacle or worship. Redemption is always prior to righteousness. Unless one is redeemed, he can't be righteous. Redemption precedes righteousness, and redemption and righteousness precedes worship. If I'm unrighteous but redeemed, I really am not worshiping. He gave them the 10 Commandments after he brought them out of the land of Egypt. And then he gave them the tabernacle where they were to worship. And this is the sequence in which we follow. So Christianity is really not just an affirmation of values. It's an affirmation of a transcending world that has precedence over this world. One difference between Buddhism and Hindu worship, in distinction to ours, is theirs is an affirmation of their values. Christianity goes far beyond just an affirmation of the values. And that's why liberal worship today is not worship. The substance has been corrupted. So when you hear press reporters talking about the fundamental difference between the evangelicals and the moderates and the Southern Baptists is whether the Bible is literally true in everything that it affirms or just taken in spirit, the boys don't know what they're talking about. It's not as simplistic as that. It's like saying the difference between a liberal pilot and a moderate pilot is whether one believes the manual or the other doesn't. Well, does it matter whether you believe the manual or not? So to just take a statement like that and make us look like idiots is talking out in a vacuum without realizing that we are either looking for a truth outside of ourselves or within ourselves. And the substance of modern liberal worship is not worship at all, because the substance has been corrupted. And you can have the two same forms, with one having substance and the other having no substance. See, the difference between the evangelical and the liberal was when the God is Dead movement came about. The liberal said, dialogue, don't defend. So he ended up dialoguing with nothing left to defend. And the evangelical went about saying, proclaim, don't persuade. And he ended up proclaiming in a vacuum without persuading the people. So here's where we are dealing with the area of more than just values. Number 3, corruption of substance. That the purpose of worship is to produce happiness rather than holiness. That the purpose of worship is to produce happiness rather than holiness. I used to say to my students at NIAC that the thunder and lightning at Sinai for Moses was not so that he could enjoy the glow on the landscape. Moses could have come back saying that was a beautiful scenery. You ought to have seen it. But the rest of the Israelis down there were so terrified by this that's when they came out with that famous statement. And I've often wondered what would have happened if they hadn't done that. Whether the whole future of Israel's history would have been different. When they said, look, after seeing what we've seen, we really cannot come into the presence of God that easily. Will you be our spokesman for us? And in a sense, they squandered their priesthood in that one request. I think that's a very fascinating verse. See, Moses wanted Aaron to do it. The people wanted Moses to do it. And before you knew, God was really looking for somebody who would dare to come to him and hear what he had to say and follow along. So the thunder and lightning at Sinai is not so that Moses could enjoy the glow on the landscape. Number 5, when one can unconsciously confuse an aesthetic experience with a worship experience. When one can confuse an aesthetic experience because it was something beautiful with a worshipful experience. Let me see if I can illustrate this. You can have a tremendously overwhelming feeling at the end of an evening without worshiping. And I think that is what I'm driving at. For example, it is possible to even generate a great feeling after an evening of entertainment. And so that was beautiful singing, beautiful voices, beautiful stage, beautiful everything, beautiful hall, beautiful all of this, without the experience of worship. That is a corruption of substance. So you can, you know who are the best ones at this? Are politicians at great ceremonial occasions. When they make tremendous speeches that everybody goes away feeling so good about it. And yet it has got very little to do with the activity of worship, aesthetics. And we have to watch this very carefully in the West because we have access to such aesthetics. You know, we can have a beautiful building, we can have a beautiful colors, we can have beautiful, you go into some of these places and they've got so little of everything that when they do walk out there, you've got to know that they are obviously not here for an aesthetic experience, because there aren't any aesthetics. You have to bring your own with you type of thing. But the aesthetic experience. And lastly, to confuse being entertained. To confuse being entertained with worshiping. When you put these forms and substance together, I remember speaking at a campaign where the theme song every day was, "It's bubbling, it's bubbling, it's bubbling in my soul. It's singing, it's laughing since Jesus made me whole. Folks don't understand it, nor can I keep it quiet. It's bubbling, 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 bubbling day and night." And I was a young evangelist starting out there in Eastern Canada, and I remember the first picture that was conjured up in my mind was a Christian who was sound asleep but grinning from ear to ear, because it was bubbling, 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 bubbling day and night. That was exactly the image that came in my mind. Somebody sound asleep but laughing. You take those corruptions of errors and forms, and if you were a non-believer and you came in here, you'd either think of Christianity as something that it is not, or you would think of your people as being hypocrites. They'd say, "Oh, look, the fellow who brought me here, I can tell you he's not bubbling day and night. And there are others I know too who are not bubbling day and night, and they are Christian people." This is the reason for it. We confuse being entertained with worshiping. And please don't get me wrong. If I see some little 5-year-old stand up and sing or whatever and make a few mistakes in the process, I can really have a great laugh and truly be entertained. And there is nothing wrong with being entertained. The point of difference here is not that this is wrong and this is right. It is only to say that this is not this. That is all. That is the only point we are making. So those are some of the areas that we deal with in errors and forms and corruptions of substance. My next subheading here is what I've called theological foundations for worship. Theology serves 3 functions. And by the way, theology, of course, the study of God. Sometimes I like to look at it as the theos, the logos, the Father, the Son, and if you can bring in the Spirit there. But theology is the study of God. It serves 3 functions. It is genitive, that is, it generates. It is critical, and it is conservative. If you ask somebody whether he is a Calvinist or an Arminian, sometimes 9 times out of 10, he goes to the Bible as a Calvinist or an Arminian, forces the Scripture to fit his position. And so rather than generating his theology from his study, he forces his study to fit his theology. I'll give you a good example of this. When I was speaking in Thailand, we had the question of tongues. All right? And 1 hour, by the way, 1 hour to answer that question. And I opened the scriptures. I said, I guess that's a safe place to begin. And let's go to it. And I said to them, I want to ask you some questions. I said, Paul very often taught truth through asking questions. Is the law therefore evil? Hardly, I said, so an interrogative question is where the answer is obvious. He is only raising it in a question rather than a statement form. I said, so he closes 1 Corinthians 12 with these series of questions, and I said, and I want you to answer all of them in what answer Paul was expecting. I said, here are his questions. Are all apostles? I said, what is the answer? No. Are all prophets? I said, what is the answer? No. Are all teachers? What is the answer he's expecting? No. Do all work miracles? No. Do all have gifts of healing? No. Do all speak in tongues? One of the girls says, I don't know. You see what she was doing? Theology wasn't generating her position. Her position was generating theology. Now, what I'm trying to say is, and it's very, very important to hear this, sound theology does not guarantee good worship, but it is indispensable to it. Sound theology does not guarantee good worship, but it is indispensable to it. Which means there is no substitute for studying and knowing God if one is to truly lead in worship. Now, Radhakrishnan, the Indian philosopher, said this, and I want you to listen very carefully. He said, the problem with Christians is that they are worried about right doctrine and not right conduct. Now, my question to Radhakrishnan is, wait a minute, how do you know what right conduct is until you know what right doctrine is? Systematic theology is necessary. If what you're saying is our problem is we worry about right doctrine and then don't worry about how we live, that's another problem. But if you're saying right doctrine is not important, you have no right to say that. Scriptures, hermeneutics, interpretation, biblical theology, inductive Bible study, systematic theology, and that's when you come into worship. Then you come into homiletics preaching. So the ultimate, thus saith the Lord, stands on an awful lot of levels. So when the evangelist stands up and says, the Bible says, he is preceding that by this. And so genitive goes back to this. Genitive, it generates good theology, generates worship. Secondly, critical. When you understand something theologically, you're able to critique properly. If you don't have good theology, it's like trying to discuss a measurement without an absolute. It can't be done. And lastly, conservative. If you've got good orthodox theology, it conserves worship. You will generally find that the theologians will die in a society first, and then its Bible colleges and its pastors. Where you have not got good teaching coming through and not good conservative theology, you will end up with an awful lot of heterodoxy. My Greek teacher in Bible school used to say the reason you guys are not good Greek students is because you're not good English students. He said, I can't teach you Greek until you've learned English, since that's the medium that I'm using with which to teach you Greek. And the reason many of us do not know what cults are is because we have forgotten what orthodox theology is. Follow me? The only way to know whether something is heresy is to know what is the orthodox position on it. And good theology generates, criticizes, and conserves. And I'm using the word criticizes not in the pejorative sense, but in the constructive sense. And this is where I think as leaders we can help those who are going into error. You say, look, you had a service in which you had people do this and this and this and this. How do you feel that measures up with the New Testament concept of such and such? You're critiquing the pattern at that point on the basis of theology. All right, so those are the three roles of theology. Obviously, there are many more. And under the theological foundations for worship, we are dealing with the person and the nature of God. Let me just look at those four and state them for you. God is transcendent. By transcendent, I mean God is different from us, not just in degree, but in kind. Very key. When this Christian and Missionary Alliance sent out a doctrinal questionnaire, I had to fill it out in 1 hour and send it back because they thought they had it with them when I was going to be licensed, and they found out they didn't have it. So I got this Western Union overnight to fill out in an hour and send back. And the first question was, God is perfect, explain. I said, my, that's wonderful, you know. I said to Margie, the only more difficult question could be define God and give 2 examples. You know, God is perfect, explain. Thankfully, there was only this much of space in which to do the explaining. Because I can assure you, the longer the answer, the greater the possibility of heresy. And I just answered it in 1 line. God is the only entity in this world, the reason for whose existence is in Himself. Every other entity looks for the reason of its existence outside of themselves. So that in itself is the perfection of life. When you are undependent, uncreated, infinite, you are perfect. So man is not a difference in degree. Man is a different in kind. We are the dependent, created, contingent, worshipping the living, true, only God. That's why he says through Habakkuk, of what value is an idol? It cannot speak. It teaches lies. You have created it with your own hands. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him. That's basically what he's saying to Habakkuk is shush. Be quiet, Habakkuk, and listen, for I am going to speak to you. So when you're dealing with the transcendent God, your worship is worshiping the transcendent one. The doctrine of transcendence. By that I mean all the reverence and the awe and the proskunine and the latreia and the liturgia and the homologia, all of this is going in, directed towards the transcendent one. And we need to remember that no matter how near he gets, he is still transcendent.
And that's where we'll have to stop today. Ravi challenged us with some corruptions of substance, reminding us not to confuse worship with entertainment or with good feelings. Our worship must go deeper than that, with solid theology as a foundation. We want you to know that it's an encouragement to us at RZIM to receive feedback from you. Please contact us and let us know that you're listening. If you'd like your own copy of today's message, just ask for CD or cassette album 209, The Leadership Workshop on Worship. Again, that's CD or cassette album 209, The Leadership Workshop on Worship. When you place an order, ask for your free copy of Ravi's newsletter, Just Thinking. The newsletter contains articles by Ravi and members of his ministry team that can be a helpful tool for understanding the issues of our day and for engaging the culture around you with the gospel. Now, there are several ways to contact our ministry. You can visit our website at rzim.org, where you can learn more about Ravi's ministry, read insightful articles, and explore the online store. That website again is rzim.org. You can also call us, and our order line is available 24 hours a day at 1-800-448-6766. That's 1-800-448-6766, and we'd be glad to help you there as well. If you prefer to write, address your envelope to RZIM, Post Office Box 921-939, Norcross, Georgia 30010. That's RZIM, Post Office Box 921-939, Norcross, Georgia 30010. If you listen in Canada, that address is 50 Gervais Drive, Suite 315, Toronto, Ontario, M3C 1Z3. The Canadian address once again is 50 Gervais Drive, Suite 315, Toronto, Ontario, M3C 1Z3. Please be sure to give us the call letters of this station when you contact us. That helps us to better evaluate the effectiveness of this broadcast. This weekly program, Let My People Think, is a listener-supported radio ministry and a production of Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, Atlanta, Georgia.